The early morning fog clung to the airfield at Bowling Field outside Washington, D.C. on June 12, 1945. Oberfeldwebel Karl Müller stood frozen in place, his mouth slightly agape as he watched the scene unfolding before him. Just 3 months prior, he had been servicing Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters for the Luftwaffe's JG-52 on the Eastern Front. Now wearing a standard-issue American mechanics coverall with a small POW patch sewn onto the shoulder, he stared in disbelief at the enormous aircraft repair depot stretching before him. What had been described to him as a temporary assignment was clearly something far more significant. Row after row of P-51 Mustangs, B-17 Flying Fortresses, and P-47 Thunderbolts stood in various states of disassembly. American mechanics moved with practiced efficiency between workstations that were stocked with an abundance of spare parts, specialized tools, and testing equipment that Müller had only dreamed of during his final desperate months servicing the Luftwaffe's increasingly dilapidated fleet. "Impressive, isn't it?" asked Technical Sergeant James Donovan, the depot's chief of maintenance operations. "We'll process more than 70 aircraft through this facility this week alone. That's just one of 17 similar facilities across the country." Müller could only nod silently, his engineering mind racing to calculate the implications. In his entire career with the Luftwaffe, he had never seen such an organized and well-supplied maintenance operation. The Germans had been told that America was a nation of shopkeepers and farmers, incapable of building sophisticated war machines in significant numbers. Yet here, before his very eyes, was evidence that everything he had been told was a lie. The hundreds of aircraft in various states of repair, the thousands of precisely organized spare parts, the specialized diagnostic equipment, it all spoke to an industrial capacity that dwarfed anything the Third Reich had achieved, even at the height of its power. What Karl Müller saw that morning defied 12 years of indoctrination and revealed a truth that would forever change his understanding of the war. Germany had never stood a chance against the American industrial colossus. The journey that brought Karl Müller to Bowling Field began in March 1945, when his Luftwaffe ground crew was overrun by advancing American forces near Kaiserslautern. As a non-commissioned officer with valuable technical skills, Müller expected harsh treatment. Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as vengeful and brutal, particularly toward members of elite military units like the Luftwaffe. The Reich's Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda had circulated stories of Allied atrocities against German prisoners, emphasizing that technical specialists would be subjected to particularly harsh interrogation to extract military secrets before being sent to labor camps. What Müller and his fellow captured Luftwaffe ground crew found instead was a systematic processing operation that sorted prisoners based on their skills and expertise. After basic interrogation and registration at a temporary holding facility near Frankfurt, Müller was identified as having advanced training in aircraft maintenance and hydraulic systems. Rather than facing a prolonged imprisonment, he was offered the opportunity to use his technical skills at an American maintenance facility. Initially suspicious that this was a ploy to extract sensitive information, Müller soon realized the Americans had little interest in Luftwaffe maintenance protocols. They were simply facing a shortage of qualified mechanics as their global operations continued to expand, even as victory in Europe appeared increasingly certain. The political and military situation in the spring of 1945 had created unique logistical challenges for the American forces. While the war in Europe was reaching its conclusion, the conflict in the Pacific continued to demand enormous resources. The American military was simultaneously demobilizing certain units in Europe while maintaining a massive occupation force and redirecting other units to the Pacific theater. This complex ballet of men and material required efficient use of all available resources, including the technical expertise of former enemies. The contrast between German and American industrial capabilities had become increasingly apparent as the war progressed. By 1943, American factories were producing aircraft at a rate that German intelligence officers initially dismissed as impossible propaganda. The United States had manufactured more than 85,000 military aircraft in 1943 alone, more than Germany produced during the entire war. The Ford Motor Company's massive Willow Run plant in Michigan was assembling a complete B-24 Liberator heavy bomber every 63 minutes at its peak production, a statistic that German intelligence analysts refused to believe until captured airmen confirmed the numbers. While German aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf Fw 190 were individually excellent machines, they were produced in workshops that combined mass production with traditional craftsmanship. Each aircraft required significant hand-fitting of components, limiting production rates and complicating maintenance in the field. By contrast, American aircraft were designed from the outset for mass production, with interchangeable parts and simplified maintenance procedures that allowed for rapid repair and return to service. The disparity extended beyond production numbers to the entire logistical chain supporting combat operations. By 1944, American air units could expect replacement aircraft within days of losses, while German squadrons might wait weeks or months. More tellingly, American maintenance units operated with an abundance of spare parts, specialized tools, and technical documentation that allowed them to keep aircraft in combat-ready condition despite the intense operational tempo. German maintenance crews, by contrast, were increasingly forced to cannibalize damaged aircraft for parts and improvise repairs as the Reich's industrial base came under sustained Allied bombing. Before his capture, Karl Müller had served as the chief hydraulics specialist for a Gruppe of JG-52, responsible for maintaining the complex hydraulic systems of 24 Messerschmitt fighters. His unit had begun the war with a full complement of specialized tools, diagnostic equipment and spare parts. By early 1945, they were fabricating replacement parts from scavenged materials and performing maintenance operations without proper tools or technical documentation. The last months had been a desperate struggle to keep just a handful of fighters operational, with pilots often flying aircraft that would have been deemed unairworthy in earlier years. Müller's experience was not unique. Luftwaffe. Senior Master Sergeant Werner Holzapfel, captured near Hamburg in April 1945, had served as an aircraft electrician with JG-1. By the end, he later wrote in a post-war memoir, we were connecting ignition wires with pieces cut from the copper wiring of bombed buildings. We used leather from our own boots to replace worn gaskets. When American forces captured our airfield, I expected they would execute us for the condition of our aircraft. Instead, they seemed more interested in how we had managed to keep them flying at all. When Müller arrived at Bowling Field in June 1945, he was one of 37 German POWs with aircraft maintenance experience who had been selected for the Technical Assistance Program. The group included engine specialists, airframe technicians, electricians, and armament experts. They were assigned to work alongside American mechanics, initially under close supervision, but gradually given more responsibility as they demonstrated their expertise and reliability. The American maintenance depot at Bowling Field was unlike anything Müller had experienced in his Luftwaffe service. The facility occupied more than 27 acres, with 12 enormous hangars dedicated to different aspects of aircraft maintenance: engine overhaul, airframe repair, avionics, hydraulics, and final testing. Connecting these hangars was a complex network of taxiways and test areas, allowing aircraft to move efficiently through the maintenance process. Most striking to Müller was the organization of the facility. Each hangar was arranged in a production line format, with aircraft moving from station to station as specific maintenance tasks were completed. The first thing that struck me was the lighting, Müller later recalled in a 1962 interview. The entire facility was brighter than day, with powerful electric lights illuminating every corner. In Germany, we had been working by flashlight for the last year of the war due to fear of Allied bombing and fuel shortages. Here, no one gave a second thought to having hundreds of bright lights burning around the clock. The abundance of electrical power was just the first of many shocks awaiting the German POWs. Captain Robert Anderson, the officer in charge of integrating the German specialists into the maintenance operation, took Müller on a tour of the facility on his second day. Their first stop was the parts warehouse, a building the size of a soccer field, filled with meticulously organized components for every aircraft type serviced at the facility. "This is just our local inventory," Anderson explained, as Müller stared at shelf after shelf of sealed components. "If we need something that isn't here, we can have it delivered from the central depot within 24 hours. For critical components, we can get them flown in within 6 hours from any of our East Coast facilities." Müller could hardly process what he was seeing. The warehouse contained more spare parts for P-51 Mustangs alone than he had seen for all Luftwaffe aircraft combined in the previous year. Each component was sealed in protective packaging, complete with detailed documentation and testing certification. Most shocking to Müller was the standardization. Parts were truly interchangeable, requiring minimal adjustment or fitting before installation. In Germany, we had parts that were supposedly interchangeable, but in reality, each required individual fitting, Müller explained to Anderson. A replacement wing flap mechanism for the Bf-109 might require hours of adjustment before it would function properly. Even components from the same factory often had significant variations. Anderson nodded unsurprised. "That's the difference between craftsmanship and mass production," he said. "Your aircraft are beautiful machines, but they're built like fine watches. Each one slightly different. Ours are built like Ford automobiles, absolutely standardized. It sacrifices some performance, but we can build them faster than you can shoot them down." The tour continued to the engine overhaul facility, where rows of Allison V1700 and Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines were being systematically disassembled, inspected and rebuilt. The operation ran 24 hours a day, with 3 shifts of mechanics processing more than 60 engines per week. Each engine moved through 27 distinct stations, with specialized teams handling specific aspects of the overhaul process. "How many man-hours does a complete engine overhaul require?" Müller asked, watching a team of 3 mechanics efficiently disassembling an Allison V1700. "About 80 man-hours for a standard overhaul," Anderson replied. "If we're just replacing a specific component, maybe 12 to 24 hours depending on accessibility." Müller shook his head in disbelief. "In my last squadron, we would need at least 200 hours for a complete overhaul of a DB605 engine, and that was if we had all the necessary parts and tools, which we almost never did in the final months. The differences extended beyond parts availability and maintenance procedures. The American approach to technical documentation was a revelation to the German POWs. Each maintenance procedure was documented in detailed, step-by-step technical manuals that combined clear text instructions with exploded view diagrams and precise specifications. These manuals were printed on high-quality paper and distributed in abundance. Every workstation had its own complete set, and mechanics were encouraged to write notes and suggestions for improvements, which were regularly collected and incorporated into updated versions. In contrast, Luftwaffe technical documentation had become increasingly scarce as the war progressed. By 1944, many maintenance units were sharing a single set of increasingly outdated manuals, often hand-copied when new aircraft variants arrived without accompanying documentation. Technical updates were sporadically distributed on poor-quality paper that quickly became illegible in the field conditions of the Eastern Front or North Africa. What particularly impressed Müller was the American approach to training and specialization. Rather than expecting mechanics to become generalists out of necessity, as had happened in the resource-constrained Luftwaffe, American maintenance operations embraced deep specialization. A mechanic might spend his entire wartime service becoming an expert in a single aircraft system, hydraulics, electrical, engines, or armament. This specialization allowed for greater efficiency and expertise, but it required a much larger workforce, another luxury afforded by America's vast manpower resources. By the end of his first week at Bowling Field, Müller had been assigned to the hydraulic systems team for P-51 Mustangs. His expertise with the similar systems on the Bf-109 made him immediately valuable, and he found himself working alongside Sergeant Frank Garrity, a former auto mechanic from Detroit, who had been maintaining aircraft hydraulics since 1942. "You Germans overthink everything," Garrity told him after watching Müller meticulously disassemble and inspect a landing gear actuator. "That's a nice approach when you have time, but we've found that 90% of hydraulic failures can be diagnosed with 5 basic tests. If those don't find the problem, we just replace the entire assembly and send the old one back to the factory for rebuilding. It's faster and more reliable in the field. This replace rather than repair philosophy was alien to Müller's experience, where every component was precious and had to be repaired, if at all possible. The American approach was enabled by their industrial capacity, but also reinforced that very strength. Standardized parts could be mass-produced more efficiently than they could be individually repaired in the field, creating a virtuous cycle of increased production and simplified maintenance. As the German POWs integrated into the maintenance operations at Bowling Field, they began to share stories and observations among themselves during their off-duty hours. Their collective experience painted a comprehensive picture of American industrial and logistical superiority that was far more convincing than any single observation. Feldwebel Heinrich Wagner, who had been assigned to the engine overhaul facility, described watching 50 new replacement engines arrive in a single shipment. They came packed in these waterproof containers, each with a complete set of tools and spare parts. The containers themselves were of higher quality than anything we had in Germany, made of aluminum and sealed against moisture with rubber gaskets. When I asked if this was unusual, the American sergeant just laughed and said they received similar shipments 3 times a week. Unteroffizier Fritz Weber, working in avionics repair, was stunned by the testing equipment available to American technicians. They had diagnostic machines that could test an entire radio set in 15 minutes. We would have needed days to perform the same checks manually, and the precision of their instruments, oscilloscopes, signal generators, voltage regulators, was beyond anything I had seen. When I mentioned this, my supervisor showed me a warehouse with hundreds of backup instruments still in their original packaging. Perhaps most revealing was the experience of Oberfeldwebel Kurt Schmidt, who had served as an armament specialist with JG-2. Assigned to the weapon systems maintenance team, Schmidt was surprised to find that the Americans were already familiar with many of the innovations that German engineers had considered revolutionary. I tried to explain the electric priming system we had developed for the Mk-108 cannon, Schmidt recounted. The American officer listened politely, then showed me 3 different variations they had tested and rejected because they were too complex for field maintenance. They had opted for a simpler system that was marginally less efficient but could be maintained by any mechanic with basic training. That was when I truly understood the American approach. They built weapons that could be maintained by average men in difficult conditions, while we built weapons that required expert technicians working in ideal conditions. As summer turned to fall in 1945, the German POWs at Bowling Field gained a more comprehensive understanding of America's war production capabilities. During a facility-wide briefing in September, Lieutenant Colonel William Harrison shared production statistics that left even the most skeptical Germans in shock. The numbers revealed a truth no propaganda could hide. America's industrial output had not just matched but utterly overwhelmed the combined production of Germany and Japan. In 1944 alone, American factories had produced more than 96,000 aircraft, 238,000 artillery pieces, and more than 29,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. During the same period, American shipyards had launched more than 8 million tons of naval vessels, including 11 fleet aircraft carriers, 7 battleships, 48 cruisers, and 149 destroyers. By comparison, Germany had built approximately 39,000 aircraft in 1944, its most productive year of the war. Even more impressive to the German specialists was the quality maintained despite this massive production. Unlike German factories, which had seen declining quality as they increasingly relied on forced labor and dwindling raw materials, American production had actually improved in both quality and quantity throughout the war. New aircraft models introduced in 1944 and 1945 incorporated lessons learned from combat experience while maintaining the standardization that enabled mass production. The Americans didn't just outproduce us, Müller observed in his personal journal. They out-engineered us by understanding the relationship between design, production, and maintenance. A brilliant design that can't be mass-produced or easily maintained is ultimately worthless in a global war. This realization was further reinforced when the POWs were shown training films produced for American factory workers. These films emphasized the direct connection between production quality and the lives of frontline servicemen, using actual combat footage and testimonials from returning veterans to motivate workers. One film particularly affected Muller. It showed P-51 pilots describing how the reliability of their aircraft had saved their lives during long missions over Germany. Every leak in a hydraulic line, every electrical connection that fails, every engine that sputters at the wrong moment, these aren't just manufacturing defects, they're potential death sentences for the young men flying these aircraft, a silver-haired factory manager told the assembled workers in the film. When you tighten that connection or check that weld, you're not just doing a job, you're saving American lives. The emphasis on quality control was evident throughout the American production system. Each aircraft component arrived at Bowling Field with detailed documentation tracking its manufacturing history. Which factory had produced it, which worker or team had assembled it, which inspector had certified it, and the results of standardized testing procedures. If a component failed in service, this documentation allowed for rapid identification of any systemic problems, which could be immediately addressed at the source. By contrast, as the war progressed, German production had increasingly sacrificed quality for quantity under the pressure of Allied bombing and resource shortages. Components produced in different factories or by different shifts within the same factory often had significant variations, complicating both assembly and maintenance. As skilled German workers were drafted into military service, their replacement by less skilled foreign and forced laborers led to declining production quality, despite harsh penalties for manufacturing defects. The differences extended beyond individual components to the entire philosophy of aircraft design. American aircraft were increasingly designed with maintenance in mind. Access panels were standardized, components were arranged to allow for easy removal and replacement, and systems were simplified where possible to reduce maintenance requirements. A P-47 Thunderbolt could have its engine replaced in less than 4 hours under field conditions. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 engine replacement typically required at least 12 hours in a fully equipped maintenance facility. Even more telling was the approach to aircraft damage. German aircraft were designed with an emphasis on performance and weight reduction, often at the expense of durability and damage resistance. American aircraft, by contrast, incorporated numerous features specifically designed to improve survivability. Self-sealing fuel tanks, armored cockpits, redundant control systems, and robust structural components that could absorb significant damage while keeping the aircraft flyable. They build their aircraft expecting them to be shot, observed Feldwebel Wagner. We built ours hoping they wouldn't be. In October 1945, the German POWs at Bowling Field were given an opportunity that further expanded their understanding of American industrial capacity. As part of an educational program, they were taken on a guided tour of the Glen L. Martin Aircraft Factory in Baltimore, Maryland, one of dozens of major aircraft manufacturing facilities operating across the United States. The scale of the operation was unlike anything the Germans had seen. The main assembly building covered more than 17 acres under a single roof, with multiple production lines operating simultaneously. The facility employed more than 43,000 workers at its peak, producing PBM Mariner patrol bombers and Martin B-26 Marauder medium bombers. By the time of the POW's visit, the factory had already begun transitioning to peacetime production, but much of the wartime manufacturing equipment remained in place. What most impressed the German technicians was the level of precision achieved despite the massive scale of production. Components manufactured months apart and in different facilities fit together with minimal adjustment. This standardization was achieved through sophisticated quality control procedures and the extensive use of precision manufacturing techniques that the German aircraft industry had only begun to adopt in the final years of the war. The tolerance standards they maintain would be considered exceptional in our best factories, noted Müller in his journal. Yet here they achieve this precision with workers who were selling shoes or driving taxis 3 years ago. Their training programs and specialized machinery compensate for the lack of traditional craftsmanship. The tour included a visit to the factory's massive parts warehouse, where components for thousands of aircraft were stored in a system that allowed any specific part to be located and retrieved within minutes. The inventory management system tracked not only the quantity and location of each component, but also its manufacturing history, inspection status, and scheduled usage, all without the use of electronic computers, instead relying on an elaborate system of punch cards and mechanical sorters. We could locate and deliver any one of 37,000 distinct components to a specific workstation within 12 minutes, explained the warehouse manager, a former department store logistics expert named Howard Klein. In a peak month, we process more than 400,000 component requests without a single delivery error. This level of organization extended to the flow of raw materials into the factory. Despite wartime shortages and competing demands from other industries, the Martin factory rarely experienced significant production delays due to material shortages. A complex scheduling system coordinated deliveries from hundreds of suppliers, ensuring that the right materials arrived just before they were needed, minimizing storage requirements while preventing production bottlenecks. For the German POWs, who had experienced the increasingly chaotic German manufacturing system in the final years of the war, the contrast could not have been more stark. German aircraft production had been severely hampered by material shortages, transportation disruptions, and the decentralization of manufacturing to protect against Allied bombing. By 1944, a single Bf-109 fighter might contain components manufactured in more than 200 different locations, from large factories to small workshops scattered across occupied Europe. Coordinating this dispersed production became nearly impossible as Allied bombing degraded transportation networks and communication systems. The visit to the Martin factory was followed by a tour of a maintenance depot for B-17 Flying Fortresses at an airfield outside Baltimore. This facility specialized in performing major overhauls and battle damage repairs on aircraft returning from combat operations in Europe. The depot could process up to 30 B-17s simultaneously, with most aircraft returning to service within 7 to 14 days, depending on the extent of required work. What the German specialists found most remarkable was the depot's approach to battle damage assessment and repair. Rather than attempting to repair all damage, American technicians used standardized criteria to determine whether each damaged component should be repaired, replaced, or left as is if the damage was deemed non-critical. This triage approach dramatically reduced overhaul times while maintaining safety standards. They have these detailed damage assessment guides, explained Feldwebel Wagner after the tour, with photographs showing exactly what level of damage is acceptable for each airframe component. If the damage is within these limits, they simply note it and move on. We would have spent hours repairing damage they consider insignificant. The depot also employed specialized teams for specific types of repairs: structures, control surfaces, engines, electrical systems, and hydraulics. Each team had customized tools and equipment for their specialty, along with detailed repair manuals that provided step-by-step procedures for addressing common types of battle damage. This specialization allowed for much greater efficiency than the German approach, where maintenance teams were increasingly forced to become generalists as specialized personnel became scarce. Most impressive to the German POWs was the depot's ability to essentially rebuild aircraft that would have been written off as total losses in the Luftwaffe. A B-17 that had suffered a direct flak hit to its midsection was undergoing what amounted to reconstruction. The entire center fuselage was being replaced as a single unit, with the forward and aft sections to be reattached once the replacement center section was prepared. "This is why we could never shoot down enough of their bombers to make a difference," observed Oberfeldwebel Schmidt. "For every one we managed to destroy completely, they could rebuild 3 or 4 that we thought were destroyed. It was a mathematical impossibility for us to win the air war." The tours of manufacturing and maintenance facilities provided the German POWs with a comprehensive understanding of the American military-industrial complex that had ultimately overwhelmed the Wehrmacht. Yet perhaps the most profound revelations came not from these organized visits, but from casual conversations with their American counterparts at Bowling Field. Technical Sergeant James Donovan, who had worked as an automotive mechanic in civilian life, explained to Müller how the American automobile industry had completely converted to war production in a matter of months. Ford wasn't building cars at all from 1942 to 1945, just military vehicles and aircraft components. General Motors converted more than 100 factories to war production. Even small machine shops were producing parts for tanks, aircraft, and ships. This total mobilization of industrial capacity was something Germany had never achieved, even as Allied bombs fell on its cities. Hitler had resisted a complete conversion to war production until well into 1943, fearing the impact on civilian morale. By the time Albert Speer implemented more comprehensive mobilization measures, strategic bombing was already severely disrupting German industrial output. Equally revealing to the German POWs were American attitudes toward machinery and equipment. Where German mechanics had been trained to maintain and repair tools and equipment indefinitely, their American counterparts often treated such items as nearly disposable if they interfered with efficient operations. "I was struggling with a worn hydraulic pressure testing gauge," recalled Müller. "I spent nearly an hour trying to recalibrate it properly. When Sergeant Garrity noticed, he simply took it from my hands, tossed it into a bin marked defective equipment, and handed me a new one from a cabinet containing at least 30 identical gauges. When I expressed surprise, he shrugged and said, 'Your time is worth more than the gauge.'" This seemingly casual attitude toward equipment reflected not carelessness, but a sophisticated understanding of efficiency and resource allocation. The Americans had calculated that the productive time of skilled personnel was far more valuable than most equipment and supplies, which could be mass-produced. By contrast, the resource-constrained German military had been forced to prioritize the preservation of equipment over personnel efficiency, often requiring mechanics to spend hours repairing or improvising tools rather than maintaining aircraft. By late 1945, the German POWs at Bowling Field had undergone a profound psychological transformation. The evidence of American industrial superiority was so overwhelming that it shattered not only their understanding of the war, but many of the core beliefs that had been instilled through years of Nazi indoctrination. "I believed we were fighting a decadent, disorganized collection of democracies that lacked the will and discipline to defeat the Reich," wrote Müller in a letter to his family in occupied Germany. "What I have seen here has shown me that we were in fact fighting the most efficiently organized industrial power in history, one that could outproduce us by factors I still struggle to comprehend." This realization led many of the POWs to question other aspects of Nazi ideology. If the regime's claims about American industrial capacity had been so fundamentally wrong, what other lies had they been told? This questioning extended beyond military matters to core ideological beliefs about race, politics, and society. Unteroffizier Weber, who had been a member of the Hitler Youth since the age of 14, expressed this transformation in his personal diary. "They told us Americans were soft, undisciplined, and incapable of sustained effort. Yet I work alongside men who maintain a pace and precision I can hardly match, hour after hour, day after day. They are not driven by fear of punishment, but by pride in their work and a sense of shared purpose. This is not the behavior of an inferior society." For many of the German POWs, this cognitive dissonance was initially painful. They had built their identities around a set of beliefs that were now proven false, not through argument or propaganda, but through direct observation of incontrovertible facts. Some initially resisted, attempting to rationalize what they were seeing as exceptional or misleading, but as the evidence accumulated, denial became impossible. "It was like awakening from a fever dream," Feldwebel Wagner later recalled. "Suddenly, everything made sense. Why we had been retreating for 2 years, why our aircraft became fewer while theirs darkened the skies, why our technology that seemed so advanced at the beginning of the war had been surpassed." The myth of German superiority collapsed completely. This psychological transformation was encouraged by the American authorities, who recognized that these technical specialists could play a valuable role in post-war reconstruction if their ideological conversion was genuine. The POWs were provided with access to uncensored news reports, historical analyses of the Nazi period, and documentation of concentration camps and other atrocities that had been hidden from many ordinary Germans. While some POWs initially dismissed these materials as propaganda, their own experience with American industrial honesty, where capabilities were accurately represented rather than exaggerated, lent credibility to this new information. Gradually, most came to accept the fuller truth about the regime they had served, completing their ideological transformation. By early 1946, as the POW Technical Assistance Program began to wind down, many of the German specialists had developed genuine respect for and even friendship with their American counterparts. These relationships further eroded any remaining ideological barriers, replacing abstract hatred with concrete human connections. Sergeant Garrity invited me to dinner with his family, Müller wrote in April 1946. His wife served us pot roast and potatoes, the first real family meal I had experienced in years. Their children asked me questions about Germany with simple curiosity, not hatred. When their eldest son showed me his model aircraft collection, including several Luftwaffe models, I felt a sense of shame, but also hope. Perhaps the next generation will know each other as people rather than enemies. As the end of the POW program approached, many of the German specialists were offered the opportunity to remain in the United States as civilian technical advisors rather than returning to occupied Germany. The offer was particularly attractive given the desperate conditions in post-war Germany, where food shortages, destroyed infrastructure, and political uncertainty made the future bleak. Müller was among those who chose to stay, accepting a position with a civilian aircraft maintenance company in Ohio that serviced both military and commercial aircraft. His decision was influenced not only by practical considerations, but by a desire to be part of what he now recognized as a more functional and just society than the one he had left behind. "I came to this country as a prisoner and discovered freedom," he explained in his application for residency. "Not just physical freedom, but freedom from the lies that imprisoned my mind. I wish to build a new life based on truth, rather than returning to a place still haunted by falsehoods." Of the 37 German POWs who had arrived at Bowling Field in 1945, 23 chose to remain in the United States after the program concluded. Most found positions in the aircraft industry, where their technical skills were highly valued despite their former enemy status. Others applied their expertise to adjacent fields like automotive engineering, hydraulic systems, or precision manufacturing. Those who returned to Germany often did so with the intention of contributing to its reconstruction along more democratic lines. They carried with them not only technical knowledge, but a first-hand understanding of American industrial and organizational methods that would prove valuable in rebuilding German industry. The lasting impact of programs like the one at Bowling Field extended far beyond the individual lives of the participants. The German specialists who remained in the United States or returned to Germany became important conduits for the transfer of technical knowledge and organizational approaches that helped shape post-war industrial development on both sides of the Atlantic. In Germany, the returning POWs contributed to the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle of the 1950s that saw German industry rebuilt on more modern and efficient lines. Their first-hand experience with American mass production techniques, quality control systems, and logistical organization helped German manufacturers adapt to the post-war global economy. In the United States, German technical specialists contributed valuable expertise to the rapidly expanding aviation industry. Their knowledge of aerodynamics, jet engine technology, and advanced materials was particularly valuable as American aircraft manufacturers transitioned to jet propulsion and supersonic flight. Several former Luftwaffe technicians eventually rose to senior engineering positions at major American aerospace companies, helping design the commercial airliners that would dominate global aviation in the latter half of the 20th century. Perhaps the most significant legacy, however, was the human connection established between former enemies. As the Cold War divided Europe, these personal relationships served as a reminder that ideological differences could be overcome through shared work and mutual respect. Many of the German specialists maintained lifelong friendships with their American counterparts, their families intertwining across the decades through visits, correspondence, and eventually intermarriage. Karl Müller's story exemplified this legacy. After working for 15 years in aircraft maintenance, he established his own engineering consultancy, specializing in hydraulic systems for aerospace applications. His firm eventually employed more than 70 people, including several American veterans of the very air war that had once targeted his Luftwaffe aircraft. In 1972, he was invited back to Germany to consult on Lufthansa's maintenance operations, bringing his American-influenced methods full circle. In a speech at a 1985 reunion of former POWs and their American counterparts at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, Müller reflected on the journey that had brought him from Nazi Germany to American citizenship. The greatest weapon America deployed against Germany was not the atomic bomb or the B-17 or the P-51. It was the irresistible power of observable truth. When confronted with the reality of American industrial might, the myths that sustained the Third Reich collapsed. No propaganda could withstand the simple reality of an American repair depot filled with more spare parts than the entire Luftwaffe possessed in its final year. The story of the Luftwaffe mechanics at Bowling Field represents one of history's most remarkable ironies, that former enemies could find common ground through shared technical passion and mutual respect for competence. It demonstrates how the tangible reality of industrial capacity ultimately proved more powerful than the most carefully crafted ideological narratives. In the end, the mathematical truth of production statistics accomplished what thousands of bombs could not: the complete transformation of hearts and minds. As visitors to the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum today examine the meticulously restored aircraft of World War II, few realize that some were maintained by the very men who once fought to shoot them down. Yet in this unlikely collaboration lies a profound lesson about the power of shared human endeavor to overcome the artificial divisions of politics and war. The Luftwaffe mechanic who expected prison but found purpose in an American repair hangar represents not just a footnote in military history, but a template for reconciliation and renewal in the aftermath of humanity's most destructive conflict.